The story begins in a renowned zoo nestled in the heart of Florida, where 28-year-old Emily Mitchell works as an animal caretaker. She's been passionate about animals since her childhood, and after studying biology in college, she was thrilled to land a job at the zoo. Here, her dream job allows her to connect deeply with wildlife, an experience she cherishes. But while she spends her days surrounded by animals, Emily's personal life is less straightforward. Emily's family lives a couple of hours away in a small suburban town. Her father, John, is a retired teacher, and her mother, Martha, is a devoted homemaker. They're proud of her accomplishments but find it difficult to understand her fascination with animals. Her parents have always envisioned a more normal path for Emily, a family of her own, a stable job with predictable hours. The zoo, with its demands and unpredictability, clashes with the secure future they had in mind for her. Alongside her family, Emily's younger brother, Jake, is a loyal and supportive figure. While her parents voice their concerns, Jake is her confidant and often reassures her that her choices make sense. He encourages her to follow her heart, which, for Emily, means a life with animals. Her best friend and coworker, Sarah, also shares her love for animals. Sarah is an empathetic listener, but unlike Jake, she sometimes gently warns Emily to keep a professional distance from the animals, especially a particular gorilla named Bruno. Bruno, a western lowland gorilla, was rescued as a baby after being separated from his group in the wild. The trauma of his past left him reserved and aloof, trusting only a few people at the zoo. Over the years, Emily has built a deep connection with Bruno, winning his trust with patience and care. In her eyes, Bruno is not just an animal under her care, he's a soul that she deeply connects with. She often talks to him in her quiet moments, sharing her joys and frustrations. For Emily, her bond with Bruno is unique and goes beyond words, something she struggles to explain to others, even Jake and Sarah. As Emily's attachment to Bruno grows, so does her sense of isolation from her family and friends. She's aware that her feelings might seem irrational to others. Her mother, Martha, expresses her concerns more frequently now, urging Emily to consider a future beyond the zoo. During a recent family dinner, Martha mentioned wanting to see Emily settle down with a stable career path, maybe as a teacher or a veterinarian in a local clinic. "I worry about you, Martha said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "It's like you're in your own world there at the zoo. You spend more time with those animals than with people." "I'm happy, Mom," Emily replied, attempting to soothe her mother's worry. "Working with animals, it's where I feel I belong." Jake, observing the interaction, quickly jumped in to support his sister. "Mom, you know Em has always been this way. She's doing what she loves, and she's good at it." "Not everyone has that luxury." John, her father, nodded, though Emily sensed he also wished she would choose a less demanding path. But Emily's mind is elsewhere. She often finds herself drawn to Bruno's enclosure even outside her regular shift hours. She watches him interact with the other gorillas, noticing the unique way he behaves around her. Their connection feels inexplicably strong, almost as if Bruno understands her on a deeper level. Sometimes, when the zoo is quiet and the shadows grow long, Emily wonders if this bond she feels with Bruno is more than just the attachment between a caretaker and her charge. One evening, after the zoo had closed and she had finished her shift, Emily lingered near Bruno's enclosure. She leaned against the gate, her eyes on the gorilla as he moved around, his large, expressive eyes glancing at her with an understanding that felt almost human. As dusk settled, she started talking to him, sharing her thoughts as she often did. She spoke of her family's concerns, of the conflict between her work and their expectations, and how no one seemed to understand her attachment to the animals, especially him. To her surprise, Bruno moved closer, pressing his large hand gently against the glass, as though reaching out. Emily instinctively placed her hand against his, feeling an intense warmth. The moment felt surreal, almost magical. And for a brief instant, she felt completely understood, as if Bruno was comforting her in his own way. The memory of that evening lingered in her mind, filling her with a strange mixture of warmth and confusion. Despite her closeness with Bruno, she kept these feelings hidden from everyone, even from Sarah, who might have been the one to understand. She feared others would judge her, thinking her feelings were misplaced or even strange. Sarah occasionally noticed the faraway look in Emily's eyes whenever she spoke about Bruno, but she chose not to pry, respecting Emily's need for privacy. As time passed, Emily noticed subtle changes within herself. She felt tired more often, with bouts of nausea and fatigue that she initially brushed off as stress. Her dedication to her work left little time for self-care, and she assumed her symptoms were simply the result of overwork. However, the symptoms only intensified, leaving her perplexed and anxious. Finally, at Sarah's insistence, Emily visited a doctor, expecting a routine checkup and a suggestion to rest. But when the doctor called her a few days later with her test results, her world turned upside down. She was pregnant. The revelation shocked her to the core, bringing a flood of emotions she couldn't process. She hadn't been in a relationship or even dated anyone recently, making this discovery both impossible and terrifying. Confused and frightened, Emily struggled to understand how this could happen. She revisited every detail of her life, trying to piece together an explanation, but nothing made sense. Her thoughts inevitably turned to Bruno, but she quickly dismissed the idea as absurd and impossible. Yet, deep inside, she felt a creeping unease, a sense of dread and wonder at the inexplicable connection she shared with him. Emily chose to keep the news to herself, telling neither her family nor Sarah. She didn't know how to explain the unexplainable, and the fear of judgment kept her silent. The pressure of carrying such a secret weighed heavily on her, amplifying her anxiety as she continued her daily routines at the zoo. She avoided Bruno, feeling a pang of guilt each time she thought of him, unsure of what to make of her conflicting emotions. Emily's family, especially her mother, noticed her increasingly withdrawn demeanor, often questioning if she was okay. Jake, sensing her distress, tried to get her to open up, but Emily only assured him that work was overwhelming and left it at that. Yet, in those quiet moments when she was alone, Emily couldn't ignore the undeniable truth growing inside her. She felt a mix of awe, fear, and confusion that left her questioning everything she thought she knew. The life she had envisioned, a life dedicated to animal care and simple joys, now felt impossibly complicated and filled with secrets. With each passing day, Emily's secret became harder to conceal. Her mind torn between loyalty to her family, responsibility to herself, and the mysterious connection she shared with Bruno. The tension within her reached a boiling point as she grappled with the reality of her situation, feeling isolated in her impossible truth. The weight of the unknown loomed over her, and she realized that her life would never be the same. In the days that followed her shocking discovery, Emily's world felt surreal. She carried on with her routine, though every task seemed laden with a heaviness she couldn't escape. The idea of being pregnant should have brought joy, or at least clarity. But instead, it filled her with dread and confusion that deepened with every passing moment. She hadn't told anyone, neither her family nor Sarah. What could she possibly say? That she was expecting a child when she hadn't been with anyone. The thought alone was enough to paralyze her. Physically, Emily's body reminded her daily of the changes happening within. She felt fatigued and nauseous, emotions welling up at unexpected times. Each glance in the mirror showed subtle, barely visible changes. Yet to Emily, they were stark reminders of the inexplicable situation she found herself in. She felt utterly alone, as if she were living a strange dream, unable to wake up. Her mother, Martha, was the first to notice something different about her. Over the phone, Martha's voice softened with a maternal concern that only served to make Emily feel worse. "You sound exhausted, sweetheart," Martha remarked one evening. "Are you sure everything's all right at the zoo? You can always come home if you need a break." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm fine, Mom," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, just a little tired. "There's a lot going on with work." There was a pause on the line. Martha wasn't entirely convinced, but she decided not to press the issue. Instead, she offered a gentle reminder. We just want you to be happy. If something's wrong, you don't have to face it alone." Hanging up the phone, Emily felt an ache in her chest. She knew her family loved her and would support her, but how could she explain something she barely understood herself? The words failed her, so she chose silence, letting the burden sit heavy and unresolved. In the days that followed, Sarah also began to notice Emily's withdrawal. At work, Emily would avoid long conversations, brushing off Sarah's concerns with vague assurances. But Sarah was perceptive and had known Emily for years. One afternoon, during a lunch break, Sarah decided to confront her. "Emily, something's off." "You're not yourself lately," Sarah said, watching Emily intently. "Is there something going on that you're not telling me?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She knew Sarah cared deeply, and under different circumstances, she would have shared everything. But the uncertainty and strangeness of her pregnancy made her feel as if she were carrying a dark secret that couldn't be explained even to her closest friend. "Sarah, it's just work stress." "You know how things get around here," she replied. Avoiding her friend's gaze, Sarah didn't look convinced, but she decided not to push further. "Well, just remember, I'm here for you. Anytime, day or night, okay?" Emily nodded, her lips forcing a thin smile. "Thank you, Sarah." "I really appreciate it." After their conversation, Emily returned to her duties at Bruno's enclosure, feeling a pang of guilt for keeping her friend in the dark. How could she explain what she barely understood? Every time she approached Bruno, she felt an inexplicable tension, a mixture of warmth and trepidation that both soothed and unsettled her. Bruno seemed aware of her inner turmoil, his gaze following her every movement, his eyes filled with an intelligence that felt both comforting and unnerving. One evening, Emily lingered near Bruno's enclosure, unable to shake the feeling that he somehow understood her better than anyone else. Standing near, she felt her hand subconsciously rest on her stomach, a gesture she barely noticed at first. But when she did, a shiver ran through her. Could it be possible that her connection to Bruno was more than just a bond between caretaker and animal? That night, her thoughts spiraled, circling back to questions she couldn't shake. Memories of quiet moments with Bruno replayed in her mind, her affection for him mingling with confusion. She tried to rationalize the connection, dismissing it as mere sympathy for a creature that had suffered. But the sensation that something far stranger was at play gnawed at her relentlessly, leaving her restless and unable to find peace. As her pregnancy progressed, Emily knew she could no longer avoid facing the reality of her situation. Her belly, though still small, was beginning to show the early signs of change, a transformation she couldn't hide much longer. She found herself torn between two extremes: fear and love. Fear of the unknown, of what people would think, and of what this pregnancy truly meant. But at the same time, she felt an undeniable connection to the life growing inside her. Despite the bewildering circumstances, the stirrings of a maternal bond began to form, mingling with the mystery that enveloped her. Her parents' concern only increased as Emily's detachment grew. Martha would call more frequently, sensing something wrong but unable to pinpoint it. During one particularly tense phone call, her mother voiced her worry with a tone that left Emily feeling both supported and cornered. "Emily, you can tell us anything, right?" Martha's voice was calm but insistent. "We're family. Whatever's going on, we'll understand." Emily felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists as she struggled to find words that would satisfy her mother without revealing the truth. "I know, Mom. I need a little time to work things out on my own." Martha sighed on the other end of the line, the silence heavy between them. "All right, honey? Just remember, we're here for you." After hanging up, Emily sank under her bed, her hands resting on her stomach as she tried to calm the storm inside her. She realized she couldn't continue hiding her pregnancy much longer, especially as her symptoms became more pronounced. But the idea of revealing the truth, or even a fraction of it, felt impossible. How could she explain what she didn't understand herself? As Emily's internal struggle intensified, Jake noticed her growing exhaustion during his occasional visits. During one visit, he asked if she was truly okay, his gaze full of concern. "You look worn out." Jake said, his tone gentle. "Are you sure you're not working too hard?" Emily managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Jake." "Just a lot on my plate right now." Jake didn't press further, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual. Emily sensed his silent support, and while she couldn't share her secret with him, his presence provided a small comfort amid her turmoil. As the weeks passed, Emily's body continued to change, the signs of her pregnancy becoming more evident. She found herself instinctively avoiding mirrors, unable to reconcile the image staring back at her with the person she once knew. Each glance reminded her of the impossible truth, and the weight of it bore down on her relentlessly. Desperate for answers, Emily began researching unusual pregnancies, hoping to find anything that could explain her condition. Late at night, she would scour the internet, reading about medical anomalies and unexplained cases, but nothing she found matched her situation. The isolation of her experience only deepened, leaving her feeling as though she were adrift in a reality she could no longer recognize. Her bond with Bruno became a source of both solace and sorrow. Each time she was near him, she felt a profound connection that transcended words, an unspoken understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between human and animal. Yet, this connection also served as a painful reminder of the mystery she carried within her, a reality that defied everything she knew. One evening, as she lingered at Bruno's enclosure after hours, Sarah found her. Startled, Emily quickly composed herself, but Sarah's worried expression spoke volumes. "Emily, this isn't like you," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "You've been acting so strange lately. I don't know what's going on, but please let me help." For a brief moment, Emily considered opening up, sharing her secret with the one person who might understand. But fear held her back, the enormity of her situation too overwhelming to reveal. "I appreciate it, Sarah, I really do," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to work through this alone." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded, sensing the walls Emily had built around herself. "Just remember, you're not alone. Whatever this is, I'll be here when you're ready." After Sarah left, Emily stood in the dim light of the enclosure, her hand resting on her stomach as she watched Bruno move through his space. The silence enveloped her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of her reality. She was carrying a child whose origins defied explanation, whose presence reshaped her understanding of love and fear. As the darkness settled around her, Emily felt a single tear slip down her cheek, a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. She knew that whatever happened next, she couldn't avoid the truth forever. The life growing within her was a mystery, but it was also a part of her, a part she was determined to protect, no matter the cost. Emily's pregnancy progressed quietly, hidden beneath loose clothing and carefully calculated excuses. Each day at work became a struggle as her body continued to change and her belly became harder to hide. Yet, her determination to understand the circumstances surrounding her pregnancy drove her to keep looking for answers, even if those answers seemed out of reach. At home, she spent long nights combing through medical journals, news articles, and obscure websites, hoping to find anything that could explain her condition. Anything that could explain her condition. Her internet search history was filled with terms like unexplained pregnancy, mysterious pregnancies, and human animal genetics, none of which brought her any closer to a real answer. Every article and report seemed to fall short, leaving her feeling more isolated and confused than ever. One night, feeling particularly desperate, she typed interspecies bond into the search bar, her fingers shaking. How ways does she click through various articles that discuss the bonds between animals and their human caretakers? While most of the stories she read were about companionship and loyalty, none came close to explaining the inexplicable connection she felt with Bruno. The night grew late, her eyes strained from staring at the screen, but she couldn't stop searching. She was looking for something beyond science, something that might explain how she felt. At work, her behavior didn't go unnoticed. Sarah, concerned but respectful of Emily's boundaries, grew increasingly worried. The bags under Emily's eyes, her pale skin, and her distant manner all pointed to something being terribly wrong. Yet, whenever Sarah tried to get closer, Emily would deflect with a weak smile and assure her friend that she was just tired. Emily's family, too, grew more concerned with each passing week. Her mother called frequently, sensing that something was off. Emily's father, usually calm and patient, had also begun to question her well-being. Jake, who often visited her unannounced, noticed the change in her figure and her strained demeanor, but he chose not to pry, sensing that Emily was carrying a burden she wasn't ready to share. On a particularly quiet evening, after yet another conversation with her mother that left her feeling more isolated, Emily decided to take a bold step. She knew that if she were to find answers, she had to confront the one being who might somehow be connected to her condition, Bruno. It was after hours, the zoo almost empty, with only a few security guards making their rounds. Emily returned to Bruno's enclosure, heart pounding as she approached the glass partition. Bruno was sitting in the corner, his powerful frame silhouetted against the dim lighting of the habitat. When he noticed her presence, he slowly moved toward her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Bruno," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if you understand me, but I think we share something. I don't know how or why, but I need to understand what's happening to me." Bruno's gaze held hers, his deep, expressive eyes reflecting a calm intelligence that always seemed beyond his species. She placed her hand on the glass, and to her surprise, Bruno mirrored her movement, pressing his hand where hers rested. The moment felt charged, as if an invisible line of communication bridged the gap between them. Emily's heart thudded, her mind racing with questions that words couldn't express. For the next few days, Emily visited Bruno's enclosure during her breaks, each time feeling a deepening connection. The gorilla would respond to her presence with gentle gestures, meeting her gaze with an understanding that transcended any interaction she'd ever had with an animal. Though Bruno couldn't speak, Emily felt as if he were silently acknowledging their shared mystery. The sense of connection was almost tangible, as though Bruno knew of her secret and accepted it. But outside of her quiet moments with Bruno, the tension in Emily's life continued to grow. Her family was losing patience with her vague explanations, especially Martha, who had started visiting more frequently. One evening during a dinner with her parents and Jake, the pressure reached a boiling point. As they sat around the table, her mother's probing gaze never left her. Finally, Martha set down her fork and broke the silence. "Emily, we can all see that something is seriously wrong. You're exhausted. You're pale." And she hesitated, looking at Emily's midsection. I don't know how to say this gently, but are you pregnant? The question hung heavily in the air, and Emily felt her stomach clench. She looked from her mother to her father, then to Jake, who watched her with quiet concern. There was no escaping the truth, not when the physical signs had become impossible to hide. But the explanation was something she couldn't bring herself to say. Yes, I'm pregnant, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother gasped, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. But Emily, how? You haven't been dating anyone. We would have known. Jake reached over, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You don't have to tell us everything, he said softly. But we just want to help. Emily's throat felt tight, her heart heavy. She wished she could tell them everything, that she was as confused and frightened as they were. But how could she explain the impossible? She could hardly believe it herself. I just need some time to figure things out, she managed to say, forcing herself to hold her mother's gaze. I'll tell you everything. When I understand it myself. Her parents exchanged a worried glance but didn't press her further. That evening, as she lay in bed, Emily felt the weight of her secret more heavily than ever. She knew she couldn't keep this hidden much longer, not from herself, and certainly not from those who loved her. The next day, as she went about her work at the zoo, Emily found herself lingering by Bruno's enclosure once again. This time, she brought a small journal, hoping to record her thoughts and observations. She felt compelled to document the inexplicable, to put her feelings and suspicions into words that might someday help her make sense of everything. She sat by the glass, her pen scratching quietly as she wrote. She recorded her symptoms, her visits to Bruno, the sense of connection she felt, and even the moments of dread that crept into her mind when she considered the possibility that Bruno was somehow part of this strange reality she was living. Lost in thought, she didn't notice Sarah approaching until she spoke. Emily? What are you doing here so late? Emily looked up, startled, and quickly closed her journal. Oh, I was just taking some notes about Bruno. Sarah studied her friend, noting the worry lines etched into Emily's face. You've been spending a lot of time with him lately. I'm worried about you. You don't seem like yourself. Emily forced a smile, trying to reassure her friend. I'm okay, really. Bruno and we just have a special bond. He's been helping me get through a rough time. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. All right, but please, if you need anything at all, just tell me. You don't have to go through this alone. As Sarah walked away, Emily felt a pang of guilt for keeping her friend at arm's length. But her need for privacy and understanding was too strong. The mystery surrounding her pregnancy felt like a puzzle she had to solve alone, no matter how isolating it felt. In the following weeks, Emily's symptoms intensified. Her body continued to change, and with each passing day, she felt a deepening bond with the life growing inside her. Despite her confusion, an instinctual protectiveness emerged, as if every fiber of her being was preparing her to shield her child from the world's judgment and misunderstanding. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts any longer, Emily returned to Bruno's enclosure, feeling a sense of calm as she neared him. This time, she brought a small lock of her own hair, which she carefully wrapped in a cloth before placing it near the enclosure's edge. She didn't fully understand why she did this, but the gesture felt right, a symbolic offering. A piece of herself she wished to share with him. Bruno approached the bundle cautiously, his eyes meeting hers as he reached for it. He examined it briefly, then looked back at her, his gaze filled with what seemed like understanding. Emily felt a surge of emotion, a confirmation of their connection that words could never capture. It was as if Bruno understood the gesture, accepting it as a part of her that was now bound to him and the life growing inside her. As she walked away that night, Emily felt a strange peace settle over her, as though a small piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She still had no answers, but she felt less alone, Buoyed by the silent support of the creature who had become more than just an animal in her care, Emily's pregnancy had now entered its final days. Each movement, each breath felt like a reminder of the mystery growing inside her, a truth she had tried to make sense of alone, but which had only left her feeling more isolated. The burden of secrecy weighed heavily on her, and with the reality of her condition undeniable, Emily knew she could no longer keep this hidden from the people she loved. Over the past few months, she'd barely seen her family, excusing herself with vague explanations and insisting she was too busy. But her mother's growing had begun to simulate conversation, with phone calls becoming more frequent into her conversations with even Jake, who rarely questioned her decisions, had grown noticeably anxious, sensing that she was withholding something serious. Finally, on a quiet evening, Emily called Jake and asked him to come over. Her voice, filled with a quiet desperation, caught his attention immediately. He arrived quickly, bringing with him the familiar, comforting presence she had always leaned on. As they sat across from each other in her small living room, Emily struggled to find the right words, the right way to explain what had happened. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound impossible." Jake leaned forward, concern evident in his eyes. "Emily, whatever it is, I'm here for you." "Just tell me." Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, piecing together the strange, surreal experience of the past few months, the inexplicable pregnancy, the bond she felt with Bruno, and the growing belief that her connection to the gorilla was far deeper than she could explain. Her words came in hesitant fragments, each one a painful truth she had tried to hide even from herself. "I know it sounds crazy," she whispered, looking away. "But somehow I feel like Bruno and we share something. It's like he's a part of this, of everything that's happening to me. I don't know how or why, but I just feel it." Jake sat in stunned silence, his gaze never leaving hers. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a fierce protectiveness that had always defined their relationship. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady. "Emily, I don't understand any of this, but I believe you." His hand reached out to cover hers, a simple gesture of reassurance that steadied her racing heart. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she gripped his hand, the weight of her secret lifting, if only slightly. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Jake's unwavering support allowed her to breathe a little easier, even as uncertainty loomed large as the due date drew closer. Emily's family grew more alarmed by her increasingly secluded life. Martha and John had been calling constantly, demanding to see her. Emily knew she couldn't keep avoiding them, but the thought of explaining the impossible left her paralyzed with fear. Yet she knew she owed them the truth, however unimaginable it might seem. On a cold afternoon, Martha and John arrived unannounced at her apartment. She opened the door reluctantly, letting them in and bracing herself for the questions that would inevitably follow. Her mother's eyes scanned her, taking in the visible signs of her pregnancy, and the shock was instant. "Emily, you're pregnant?" Martha's voice wavered, her expression a mixture of confusion and distress. Emily nodded, tears forming in her eyes. She struggled to find words, but no explanation felt adequate. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she make them understand what even she couldn't fully grasp? I don't know how to explain it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't understand it myself, but I know this. This child is a part of me. And I need you to trust me." John placed a hand on Martha's shoulder, his face lined with worry but softened by a father's love. "Emily, we're here for you. No matter what this is, we're not going anywhere." As she looked into her parents' eyes, Emily felt a glimmer of relief. They didn't understand her circumstances, but their love for her was unwavering. She realized that despite everything, she would not have to face this alone. The day of the birth arrived sooner than anyone had anticipated. Emily had planned to give birth quietly, but as her contractions intensified, Jake insisted on taking her to the hospital. Despite her fear of what the doctors might discover, she was in no condition to argue. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and uncertainty, and as they arrived, Emily's anxiety only deepened. She feared not only for her child, but for how the world would react to the reality of their existence in the sterile delivery room, surrounded by doctors and nurses. Emily felt an overwhelming wave of fear and protectiveness. She gripped Jake's hand tightly, his calm presence a lifeline amid the chaos of emotions within her. As she fought through the pain, her mind raced with thoughts of Bruno, the unbreakable bond she felt, and the child she was about to bring into a world that might not understand them. After hours of labor, Emily's child was born a small, delicate figure with features that defied explanation. Covered in fine, soft hair that bore an uncanny resemblance to Bruno's, the child had a face that was both human and other, an indescribable blend of her own features and something inexplicably different. The room fell silent, a medical staff staring in shock and disbelief. Emily, her body exhausted and trembling, looked down at her child with a mixture of awe and fierce love. She knew in that moment that this child was hers, a part of her and a part of the unexplainable bond she shared with Bruno. Whatever the world might say, whatever judgment they might face, she would protect this life with everything she had. Jake stood beside her, his face a mask of quiet determination. He looked at his sister and her child with acceptance, unshaken by the impossibility before him. He reached out, gently placing a hand on the baby's head, his voice soft but resolute. "This is your family," he said, his gaze steady, "and I'm here for both of you." Always, Emily felt tears spill over as she held her child close, her heart swelling with love and resolve. She knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but with her family by her side, she was ready to face them. In that moment, the questions, the fear, the confusion, all of it faded, replaced by the certainty that this child was her future, her purpose. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Emily looked at her child, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her. She knew they would face a world that might not accept them, a society that would question their very existence. But she also knew that she was no longer alone in this journey. Jake's support, her parents' love, and her own unwavering determination would carry them forward. Outside, the world waited, filled with uncertainty and unknown challenges. But as Emily held her child close, she felt a strength within herself that she hadn't known before. She was ready to embrace the unknown, to protect and love this life that had come into her world under the strangest of circumstances. The bond she had shared with Bruno, the connection she had once questioned, was now a part of her family. And with each step she took, she carried the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came their way. Together, Emily had anticipated the shock and disbelief, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the reactions that followed her child's birth. As news of the unusual nature of her baby spread, she found herself at the center of unwanted attention and scrutiny. Doctors, medical researchers, and zoo officials, everyone seemed determined to understand and dissect her child's existence, each of them grappling with the same impossible questions that haunted her. At first, the hospital staff attempted to maintain some level of confidentiality, but the whispers soon reached the ears of the zoo's administration. They called Emily in, seeking answers that even she could not provide. The director, Mr. Harrison, a man who had always supported her work at the zoo, looked at her with a mixture of compassion and bewilderment. "Emily," he began, his voice soft but filled with urgency. "We need to know, how is this possible? How could any of this have happened? She looked down, struggling to articulate her experience in a way that might make sense to anyone outside her immediate family. I don't know, she replied, her voice trembling. All I know is that my child is part of me, and I feel a connection that I can't explain. Bruno, he's part of this. Somehow, Harrison sighed, running a hand through his hair, visibly torn. We can't ignore this, Emily. People will have questions, and the zoo will be under scrutiny, but I'll do what I can to protect your privacy. Emily nodded gratefully, but she knew that her life and her child's could no longer remain hidden. The media had already caught wind of the unusual birth, and she felt a deep sense of fear and protectiveness rising within her. The idea of strangers dissecting her story, reducing her connection to Bruno to a mere curiosity, filled her with dread. Her child was more than a headline or an anomaly. This was her baby, her family. At home, Jake stood as her constant pillar of strength. He shielded her from the press, answering the door and fielding inquiries with calm resilience. Martha and John, though still shaken, gradually came to terms with the reality, accepting that their grandchild was different but still deeply loved. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of avoiding reporters and dodging question, Emily sat with Jake in the quiet of her living room, holding her child close. She looked at her brother, the exhaustion visible in her eyes. "Jake," she whispered, "I don't think I can stay here. Not with all this attention. My child deserves peace, a life away from all of this." Jake nodded, his face filled with understanding. "I think you're right. This isn't the life you wanted for your child. We could find somewhere safe, somewhere secluded where you both can live without interference." The idea of leaving filled Emily with both relief and sadness. She would miss her family and the life she had built, but her love for her child outweighed everything else. She couldn't allow her baby to grow up in an environment filled with constant judgment and fear. After a long conversation with Jake, they decided it was best for her to move to a remote cabin owned by a family friend in the countryside. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to prepare for their departure, gathering essentials and saying quiet goodbyes. Her parents struggled with her decision, but ultimately supported her, understanding that her child's safety and well-being were paramount. The final day at her apartment was bittersweet. Her mother, with tears in her eyes, hugged Emily tightly, whispering words of love and encouragement. Her father, usually stoic, also embraced her, promising to visit whenever he could. Jake loaded their belongings into his truck, a silent promise in his eyes that he would remain close no matter the distance. With one last look at her childhood home and the city she had known all her life, Emily left for the cabin, the place that would become her new sanctuary. The drive was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the gentle breaths of her sleeping child in the backseat. As they approached the cabin, a sense of peace settled over her, knowing they were finally away from the prying eyes of the world. In the months that followed, Emily found a rhythm to her life that she had never known before. Surrounded by nature, far from the noise and chaos of the city, she could focus solely on her child, bonding and learning together in their isolated haven. The forests and fields became their playground, a safe space where she could raise her child without fear. Jake visited frequently, bringing supplies and news from the outside world, but he respected the quiet life she had created. He marveled at her resilience, at the way she had embraced motherhood despite the impossible circumstances. Each visit reinforced the bond between them, a reminder that, despite the challenges, she was never truly alone. Though her days were peaceful, Emily sometimes felt pangs of sadness when she thought of Bruno. She wondered if he felt her absence, if he sensed that she was far away. Yet she knew that this was the right choice for her child. The bond she shared with Bruno had shaped her life in ways she couldn't fully understand, but her priority now was the life she had brought into the world. In time, she grew more at ease with her new reality. accepting the mystery of her child's origins as part of her life's journey. As her child began to grow, showing signs of intelligence and sensitivity that both delighted and humbled her, Emily found peace in knowing that love, above all else, would guide their future. The world might never understand the full story, and she had come to accept that. Her life was no longer about seeking answers or validation. It was about protecting, nurturing, and cherishing the family she had created. Far from society's expectations, away from the questions and judgment, Emily found a profound sense of purpose that filled every day with quiet joy. In the serenity of the forest, under the vast sky, Emily made a promise to her child. She would protect this life with everything she had, providing a world where love and acceptance reigned over doubt and fear. As she watched her child explore the world around them, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, knowing that, despite everything, she had found her place. And in that place, her hidden corner of the world, Emily knew they would thrive, bound by the mysteries of the past, but guided by a future forged in love and resilience. As the season changed and the cabin in the woods be her home, Emily settled into the Creighton to Tipton. Her days were filled with small but meaningful moments, like teaching her child to recognize different birds by their calls, exploring the forest trails, and watching the sunsets that painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her child, whom she named Leo, was growing quickly, developing a curiosity and intelligence that filled her with pride. Leo was unique in so many ways, gentle, observant, and deeply connected to the natural world around them. Emily noticed how he would sit for long moments, watching the way the wind moved through the trees or studying the way insects scurried across the forest floor, as if every detail held a world of wonder. Raising Leo in seclusion wasn't always easy. She often missed the companionship of her family and the energy of the city. She missed Sarah, her best friend who had once shared her everyday joys and frustrations, and she wondered if she would ever see Bruno again. But every time she looked into Leo's eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. The peace and safety of their quiet life was worth any sacrifice. One crisp autumn morning, as Leo played outside, Emily sat on the cabin porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her here, the strange series of events that had redefined her life in ways she could never have imagined. Her mind wandered back to the beginning, to those long nights when she had searched for answers, desperate to understand the connection she shared with Bruno. In those days, her heart had been filled with fear and confusion, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. But now, as she watched Leo explore the world around him, she felt none of that fear. She had come to realize that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The bond with Bruno, the origins of her pregnancy, these were parts of her life story that defied explanation. But they had led her to this place, to a life of profound love and purpose. Her connection with Bruno had always felt extraordinary, a meeting of souls across the boundaries of species and logic. She remembered the way he would look at her, his dark eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. In her heart, she felt gratitude for him, a quiet appreciation that transcended the strange circumstances of their bond. She hoped that wherever he was at peace, perhaps sensing that his spirit lived on through Leo over time. The ache she had felt for Bruno softened into a gentle warmth, a reminder of the mystery that had forever changed her. She knew that without him, she would never have known the depths of love and courage she was capable of. Bruno had been the beginning of her journey, and in a way, he would always be a part of her family. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the trees, Leo toddled over to her, his small face lit with excitement as he held out a handful of wildflowers. Emily smiled, taking the flowers and placing them in her hair, earning a delighted giggle from her son. In moments like these, she felt a deep contentment, a sense of belonging that filled her with gratitude. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "You've given me everything I didn't know I needed." In the years that followed, Emily continued to raise Leo in the heart of the forest, teaching him the ways of nature, the value of kindness, and the strength that came from understanding oneself. Their life was simple, filled with the quiet joys of the forest. And for Emily, it was more than enough. Her family visited occasionally, bringing with them reminders of the world beyond the wood, but they respected the life she had chosen. Each visit left her feeling both grounded in her decision and connected to her roots, a bridge between the life she had left behind and the new one she had embraced. Jake, always her unwavering support, remained her closest link to the past, and his friendship became even more precious as the years went by. Emily never returned to the zoo, and over time, the story of her child faded from the public eye. She heard from Jake that Bruno had eventually been relocated to a sanctuary where he could live out his days in a more natural setting. The thought brought her peace. She liked to imagine him there, free among the trees, just as she and Leo were. As Leo grew older, Emily told him stories of their family's journey, of the remarkable connection that had brought him into the world. She shared these tales in a way that celebrated the love and mystery without dwelling on the impossibility of it all. She wanted him to grow up knowing that he was loved beyond measure, that he was a gift born from something extraordinary. And so, in the quiet of the forest, surrounded by the life they had built together, Emily found fulfillment. Her journey had taken her far from the ordinary, leading her to a life filled with wonder, love, and acceptance. She no longer needed answers. The joy of her son's laughter, the beauty of the changing seasons, and the simplicity of their days were more than enough. With each passing day, Emily embraced the unknown, grateful for the life she had created with Leo, knowing that no matter where their story began, love was what defined their future. Love was what defined their future.